He went into the forest looking for firewood, but what he found left him frozen in shock. Lying in the underbrush, surrounded by dense foliage, was a baby, barely a few months old. But that wasn't all. Wrapped protectively around the child was a massive snake, its scales glistening under the sunlight. What happened next was something no one could have ever imagined. He entered the forest like he had many times before, looking for firewood and nothing more. But that day, something changed. A faint cry led him deeper into the woods, where he stumbled upon an unbelievable sight, a baby lying on the forest floor, with a massive snake coiled protectively around it. The unexpected discovery. The forest was alive with its usual sounds, birds chirping in the distance, leaves rustling in the breeze, and the occasional cracking of twigs underfoot. Thomas, a humble villager, had always felt at peace here. The woods provided for his family, and he knew its trails and secrets better than anyone. But today, something was different. As he wandered deeper, collecting wood in his sturdy basket, his ears caught a sound that didn't belong, a faint, high-pitched cry. At first, he thought it was a bird. But as he stopped to listen, the sound grew clearer. It wasn't a bird. It was a baby. Thomas froze, his heart skipping a beat. A baby? Out here? Alone? He adjusted the basket on his shoulder and stepped cautiously in the direction of the sound. The cries were weak but steady, guiding him deeper into the forest. The dense foliage closed in around him, the sunlight barely piercing through the thick canopy above. The air grew cooler, and a strange tension settled over the path. After what felt like an eternity, he saw it. There, in a small clearing, was the source of the cries. A baby, barely a few months old, lay on the forest floor, wrapped in a tattered cloth. Its tiny fists flailed weakly, and its cheeks were streaked with dirt. But that wasn't all. A massive snake, easily the largest Thomas had ever seen, was coiled around the child. Its scales shimmered like polished bronze in the dappled sunlight, and its head rested inches away from the baby's face. Thomas froze, his breath caught in his throat. The snake's sheer size was terrifying. Its muscular body could crush a man in seconds, and its unblinking eyes were fixed on him. Every survival instinct he had screamed at him to turn and run. But he couldn't. Because of the baby. A moment of uncertainty. Thomas stood motionless, his heart pounding so loudly he was sure the snake could hear it. He had grown up in the village, surrounded by tales of the forest's dangers. Snakes this size were rare but not unheard of. They were creatures to be respected, even feared. But what struck him wasn't just the snake's size, it was its behavior. It wasn't attacking the baby. It wasn't even threatening. Instead, it lay still, coiled gently around the child as if protecting it. Thomas's mind raced. How had the baby ended up here? Where were its parents? And why was this massive snake acting as its guardian? The baby's cries softened, its tiny chest rising and falling with each labored breath. Thomas took a cautious step closer, his eyes never leaving the snake. He didn't know much about snakes, but he knew one thing: if he made the wrong move, it could end in disaster. The decision to act. Thomas knew he couldn't leave the baby there. The forest was no place for a child, especially one so small and vulnerable. But how could he approach without provoking the snake? He thought of his own children back in the village, their laughter echoing in his memory. If it were one of them lying there, he wouldn't hesitate. His hands shook as he set the basket down quietly. He took a deep breath, steadying himself. "It's just an animal," he whispered under his breath. "It doesn't want to hurt me. It's just protecting." Step by step, he moved closer. The snake lifted its head slightly, its forked tongue flickering in and out. Thomas froze, his heart racing. The snake seemed to be watching him, gauging his intentions. He spoke softly, his voice calm and low. "I'm not here to hurt you or the baby. I just want to help." The snake didn't move. Encouraged, Thomas edged closer. When he was just a few feet away, he crouched down, his hands outstretched. The baby looked up at him with wide, teary eyes. "It's okay," he murmured, though he wasn't sure if he was talking to the baby, the snake, or himself. A guardian's decision. The moment felt like an eternity. The snake's unblinking gaze locked onto his, its body coiled tightly around the baby. Thomas didn't dare make a sudden move. Then, something extraordinary happened. The snake began to uncoil. Slowly, almost deliberately, it loosened its grip around the baby and slithered back into the underbrush. Its massive body disappeared into the shadows, leaving no trace it had ever been there. Thomas let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. He reached down and gently picked up the baby. Its cries grew louder for a moment, then softened as it nestled into his chest. The baby was safe. The journey back. With the child in his arms, Thomas began the long trek back to the village. His mind swirled with questions. Why had the snake protected the baby? How had the child survived in the forest? He glanced back over his shoulder once, half expecting to see the snake watching from the shadows. But the clearing was empty, silent except for the rustle of leaves in the breeze. As he walked, Thomas felt a strange sense of awe. He had always respected the forest, but today it had shown him something he would never forget, that even the most fearsome creatures could act with compassion. While collecting firewood deep in the forest, Thomas hears a faint cry that leads him to an abandoned baby. To his shock, a massive snake is coiled protectively around the child. As he tries to process the scene, he realizes he must act, but fear and uncertainty grip him. Fear and uncertainty. Thomas's heart raced as he crouched low in the underbrush, hidden from view. The massive snake lay still, its shiny, patterned scales glinting in the dappled sunlight. The baby was silent now, its tiny body barely moving, its breathing shallow but steady. He couldn't take his eyes off the serpent. It was unlike anything he'd ever seen in the forest before. The sheer size of the creature was intimidating. It had to be over 10 feet long, its thick body coiled protectively around the fragile child. Yet, its behavior was puzzling. The snake wasn't attacking the baby. It wasn't hissing or lunging at him. Instead, it rested its head just inches away from the infant's face, its tongue flicking occasionally as if keeping watch over its unusual charge. Thomas knew the forest well. He had grown up hearing stories about its mysteries, legends passed down from elders about creatures that acted as guardians of the land. But this defied everything he understood about nature. The weight of the decision. Thomas's first instinct had been to run. The sight of the massive snake had sent a jolt of fear through his body, and every logical part of him screamed to turn around and leave. But he couldn't ignore the helpless baby lying there, so exposed and vulnerable. What if I leave, and something worse happens, he thought, the image of the child haunting him. The baby had already been abandoned once, left in the wilderness where any predator could have taken its life. But what if the snake saw him as a threat? One wrong move, and it could strike, killing both him and the baby in seconds. Thomas clenched his fists, steadying his breath. He had to act. The thought of leaving the baby to its fate was unbearable. He studied the situation carefully, looking for any sign of aggression from the snake. Its unblinking eyes stared ahead, but its body remained still. Perhaps, he thought, it wasn't here to harm the child at all. Summoning courage, Thomas slowly reached into the pouch tied to his belt. He wasn't carrying any weapons. He'd come to the forest for firewood, not hunting, but he had a cloth and a small flask of water. He soaked the cloth lightly, planning to offer the baby some relief if he could get close enough. His voice was calm, soft, as he began to speak. "I'm not here to hurt you," he murmured, unsure whether he was talking to the baby or the snake. "I just want to help." He stepped closer, his movements deliberate, careful not to startle the snake. His boots crunched lightly against the fallen leaves, each sound seeming louder than it was in the quiet forest. The snake's head lifted slightly, its tongue flicking out as if tasting the air. Thomas froze, his pulse pounding in his ears. After a moment, the snake relaxed again, lowering its head back to the ground. Thomas took that as a sign to move forward, reaching the baby. Finally, he was close enough to see the baby clearly. Its face was dirty, streaked with tears, but its wide eyes stared up at him with a quiet curiosity. The child couldn't have been more than a few months old. Gently, Thomas extended his hand toward the baby, stopping just short of its tiny fingers. The snake shifted slightly, uncoiling just enough to give him access. It was a surreal moment. Thomas had expected the creature to lash out, to defend what it seemed to consider its charge. But instead, it almost seemed to trust him. He carefully placed the damp cloth against the baby's forehead, wiping away the dirt and sweat. The baby cooed softly, its little fingers curling around his hand. The sound brought a wave of relief and determination over Thomas. The snake's departure. As Thomas tended to the baby, the snake began to move. Slowly, its massive coils unwound, slithering off the child and into the surrounding underbrush. Its movements were deliberate, unhurried, as if it understood its job was done. Thomas watched, transfixed, as the creature disappeared into the dense foliage. For a moment, the forest was silent. Then the baby let out a soft cry, breaking the spell. Thomas scooped the child into his arms, holding it close to his chest. The tiny heartbeat he felt against his own was steady and strong. The journey back. With the baby secure, Thomas began the trek back to the village. The weight of what had just happened settled over him, filling his mind with questions. Who had left the child there? Was it deliberate, or had something tragic occurred? And why had the snake, a predator by nature, chosen to protect instead of harm? As he walked, he thought of the stories his grandmother used to tell him, tales of the forest spirits taking unusual forms to watch over the innocent. Could this have been one of those moments? The baby stirred in his arms, letting out a soft sigh. Thomas smiled despite the confusion and fear still lingering in his mind. Whatever the truth was, one thing was clear: he had been meant to find this child. And for now, that was enough. Thomas, a humble villager, found a baby abandoned in the forest, surrounded by a massive snake coiled protectively around it. Overcoming his fear, he approached cautiously, speaking softly to the creature. To his astonishment, the snake unwound itself and slithered away, leaving the baby unharmed. Holding the child in his arms, Thomas began the journey back to his village, but questions about the mysterious encounter lingered in his mind. A courageous move. The forest seemed quieter than usual as Thomas made his way back to the village, the baby nestled securely in his arms. The trees loomed overhead, their branches forming a dense canopy that filtered the sunlight into scattered patches on the ground. Despite the serene surroundings, his mind was a whirlwind of emotions: relief, confusion, and a lingering sense of awe. The baby had fallen asleep, its tiny hand clutching the edge of his shirt. Thomas glanced down at the child, his heart softening at the sight of its peaceful face. He couldn't help but wonder how it had survived alone in the forest. The thought of the massive snake protecting the baby replayed in his mind, sending shivers down his spine. Why would a predator guard an infant? He muttered to himself. The question hung in the air, unanswered. The village reacts. As Thomas approached the outskirts of the village, the familiar sounds of daily life greeted him: children laughing, pots clanging, and the rhythmic pounding of grain being milled. But as soon as he emerged from the forest with the baby in his arms, the bustling activity came to a halt. Villagers gathered quickly, their faces a mix of curiosity and concern. "What happened, Thomas?" an elderly woman asked, her eyes widening at the sight of the baby. "I found this child in the forest," Thomas replied, his voice steady but tinged with disbelief. "There was a snake. A huge one. It was wrapped around the baby, but it didn't harm it. It almost seemed like it was protecting it." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Some murmured prayers, while others exchanged uneasy glances. "A snake protecting a baby," one man scoffed, shaking his head. "That's unnatural." "Unnatural or not, it happened," Thomas said firmly. "The baby is alive because of that snake." The village elder, a wise and respected man named Oba, stepped forward. His wrinkled face was calm, but his piercing eyes studied the baby with a look of deep contemplation. "Bring the child to the council hut," Oba said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "We need to understand what this means." The mystery deepens. Inside the council hut, a fire crackled in the center, its smoke rising through a small hole in the roof. The elders sat in a circle, Thomas and the baby at the center of their attention. Oba leaned forward, his voice low and deliberate. "Thomas, tell us exactly what you saw." Thomas recounted the story in detail, describing the faint cries that had led him to the clearing, the sight of the snake coiled around the baby, and how it had retreated peacefully when he approached. When he finished, the room fell silent. The elders exchanged glances, their expressions unreadable. Finally, Oba spoke. "There are old stories, passed down from our ancestors, about the forest spirits taking on the form of animals to protect the innocent. Some say snakes, in particular, are sacred guardians, sent by the earth itself to shield those in danger." A younger elder frowned. But why would such a spirit appear now? And why this child? Oba shook his head. The forest has its secrets. Perhaps the answers will reveal themselves in time. A growing bond. Over the next few days, Thomas cared for the baby as if it were his own. The villagers, though wary at first, began to warm to the child. Women brought blankets and food, while children peeked curiously into Thomas's home, eager to catch a glimpse of the mysterious baby. But strange things began to happen. Animals that typically avoided the village started appearing near Thomas's hut. Birds perched on the roof, deer grazed nearby, and even a fox was spotted sitting calmly by the door. The villagers whispered among themselves, convinced that the baby was connected to the forest in some inexplicable way. One evening, as Thomas rocked the baby to sleep, he noticed something unusual. A faint mark on the child's wrist, almost like a birthmark, shaped like the coils of a snake. The sight sent a chill through him. Was it a coincidence, or was there more to this child's story than he had imagined? Unanswered questions. As days turned into weeks, the mystery of the baby deepened. Thomas found himself torn between wonder and unease. The baby was thriving, but its connection to the forest and the snake remained an enigma. One night, as he sat by the fire, Oba visited him. "You've done well to care for the child, Thomas," the elder said, his voice warm. "But you must be prepared. This baby may be more than just a child. The forest does not act without reason." Thomas nodded, though he didn't fully understand. "What do I do now?" Oba placed a hand on his shoulder. "For now, you protect the child. The forest chose you for a reason. Perhaps, in time, the child's purpose will become clear."